get going. Can everybody hear me okay? Because they only have these little things where I need to sit down.
Yeah.
And if I'm ever quiet, just, my voice can go up and down, just correct me, tell me to talk louder. But thanks to you guys who came today. I honestly feel like completely stupid talking after hearing Gary. Some of the stories that Gary's been through. He was pretty fascinating. But here's kind of my plan of what we're going to talk to today. Well, I know that it's kind of talked about this Billcom case study, and I will talk about it a little bit today. But my goal is more to just tell you some lessons that I've learned that I think matter a lot as you're prepping for some sort of transaction. And one thing that I've learned is that it's all the work you do well before the transaction. The transaction's just the eventual outcome. There's more luck than anything at the end. But it's all the work that you do prior to that that allows for something like that to occur. So, but my plan is I want to introduce you to me, let you guys get to know some of my experiences, strengths, and weaknesses. But then I want to talk about, introduce the topic, and I have some obvious answers of what I think it means to increase the value. But then I want to give kind of my personal take on the things that I think a CFO or a good leader does to maximize value in the company. So let's get started by saying I really hate speaking, and it's not because I'm shy. I don't think I even have any of that. I just know that there's Garys out there in the world that are so smart and have been through so much. And I look at me, who's maybe 15 years into his career, and I'm like, what do I know, right? And I think that, I kind of look at it as like, yeah, I know a little bit. I've been through some stuff, right? But as I speak today, I hope you guys all know that if we sat in a room and you guys said, I disagree with you there, I'd try to be like, yeah, you have a really good point, right? Like, I don't think that I'm brilliant or anything. I kind of like this quote, the greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, it's the illusion of knowledge. And I think that if there's one thing that I hope you guys all know that I would love to sit down and hear from you, and like what your take is and your perspective on things. And I don't pretend to be some know-it-all. But I do think I've been through some stuff, whatever it is, in my career, and I thought I could start by talking about the resume stuff. And I think this is boring, and I'm going to talk about it a bit. But I'm super biased in the sense that I'm a tech guy. I've been at high-growth companies that are tech. And both of my companies that I've really been a part of, well, I started out my career at Dell. So I started out at a pretty unique opportunity, a leadership development program. I was able to, within 3 years, have like 5 different roles. And it gave me kind of exposure to everything, right? Everything from pricing to M&A. I was part of 2 M&A transactions. And as well as I ended up on the corporate strategy team at Dell. And here's what was funny to me, is I was at the corporate strategy team of a Fortune 50 company at the time, and I could not stand how slow things were, right? I couldn't. I was like, we're working on this project. It's probably one of the top 3 sexiest projects of the entire company, and I couldn't handle it because it was so slow. And that's what made my transition over to this high growth world. And that's why I've ended up in tech. And the first place I actually ended up was in Structure, and I got there right as they landed their Series B, which is a trend of me. So I look at Series B personally as product market fit. They have product market fit, now they just need to figure out how in the freak am I going to scale this business, what is this business's potential, and how are we going to get there. And that's where I stepped in. And I was able to be a part of over $70 million of fundraising after the B. We did their some pre-IPO rounds. And then I was able to be through the IPO. So I was up there clapping up at when we took Structure public. It was pretty fun. It was kind of a cool experience where I was there about 2.5 years pre-IPO and about 2.5 or 3 years post-IPO. And I got to see kind of the evolution of a company. And then I switched over. I kind of looked at, right, in Structure, I ended up leaving right when they got a new CEO. Didn't hate the new CEO, had nothing wrong with him. I was like, yeah, that's kind of a good transition point, right? Like, I was a known quantity to the leadership team. Decided to move over and take a chance finance to be the guy, right? To be the head of finance at a high-tech growth. And that's when I went to Diddy. It was the exact same situation. My very first situation was actually Series B had just got in the door. And I ended up through Diddy. We've raised $300+ million of equity. We've done $500 million+ in debt rounds, and I can talk about those. But then we also just 3 months ago we sold the company for $2.5 billion to Billcom. But this is the resume, right? This is what people see as they look at your LinkedIn. But it's not what I think is actually what's defined me as a person or as a leader, as a CFO. I actually look at kind of throughout my career, there's way more than this, but it's the fairly significant failures that I've experienced. And I think I've experienced quite a bit. At Instructure, we had a very consistent thing we were trying to accomplish, where we had a very defined TAM. And we were always trying to increase our TAM. We were in education, though, and it was always going to hurt our market potential because your TAM is only as big as your TAM is. So we were trying to break out of it. And I was integral in the part of trying to expand that TAM, and I was part of the team that proposed a launch of a new product. We must have invested $100-something million in a product that completely failed. It was trash. And it didn't work. It ended up getting sold off before they went IPO again this recently. But that was tons of learning, and it kind of, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, some of the things I've learned come back to what I experienced when we dumped $100+ million down the tubes because we were trying to launch this new product. Another time I remember where I was in charge of the revenue forecasting team, and we completely whiffed, and I got the honor of watching the stock price drop by over 20% overnight as we got to tell the street that we missed when nothing was wrong with the business because we messed up on how we forecasted something. And there's a lot of ways where I could be the defensive and say, well, there was, no. I mean, it was foreseeable, and we messed up. And it caused a pretty big correction to our stock price. When I started at Diddy, and I said I got there right after Series B, I will never forget the moment where I'd been there less than a week, and I go up to the CEO, and I said, you realize we just raised $30 million, but we're out of money in like 3 months, right? And it wasn't because of just burning money. I mean, we were spending a lot to grow. But it was because of the complexities of the business. And it was whiplash. I mean, I was overwhelmed out of my brains for months, being, how do you raise $30 million and be out of money in 3 months? And we were, and it ended up becoming probably the 4 hardest months of my career. As Gary was saying, liquidity is everything as a CFO. And I had to figure out how to go raise debt facilities while figuring out negative economics while I had all these major business issues while I simultaneously had a liquidity issue. And I don't think I slept for 3.5, 4 months. I still have sleeping issues from the day that started at this period of time due to stress. And then lastly, one of the big defining moments of my career was COVID. COVID was absolutely terrifying for us as a business. Similar to what Gary was talking about, is we're not a bank, but we're in debt. We have charge cards. We give away cards to people. We're lending to tons of businesses, probably some of your businesses here. And in the middle of COVID, I've never seen so much irrationality ever. And it was terrifying, right? We went from February where we literally beat every single metric across our entire business, all of them. I was ecstatic. I couldn't wait. I was like, we are going to crush all of our board commitments. We are going to crush everything investors are expecting. I was pumped. And then March happened, and it was horrible, right? And we ended up having to lay off. We had a funding round that was in the bag, under term sheet, $130 million round. They walked with it, right? We ended up getting them all back. I'll lost it later. But we lost that, and we had to lay off 30% of the employees, and it was devastating to me as I felt like I failed. And I want to talk, though, as I talk about some of these things, I want you guys to know that when I look at myself and what I've been through, I don't look at these very much as like, hey, that's like a tech startup resume guy. Like, that's what you get. But it's the bottom that I think has actually defined me as a CFO. And when I think about what actually made a transaction possible, whether it was IPO or in the past, it was us getting through these pretty terrible problems or failing at some of our objectives. So an introduction to the topic, though, is how do you maximize value before a transaction? Well, I'm going to get a little tongue-in-cheek with you. and pretend like this is funny with me, but this is how I think about it. It's like, okay, let's talk about maximizing value. Do you want to have your revenue increasing or decreasing? I highly recommend having your revenue going up. Do you want your margins to be going up or be going down? I highly recommend having them go up. And these are stupid on purpose. Would you rather be hiring Kobe Bryant or Gobi? I highly recommend Kobe Bryant. Tons of Kobe Bryant, right? And then the last one is would you rather have your net income going up, flat, or down? I'm actually not sure. I'm in tech. I don't know. So if you guys know that, let me know. I'm not sure what they like. But this sounds silly and it's tongue-in-cheek, but like when it comes to maximizing the value of the business, you can pretend like there's rocket science, and I allow you to pretend like there's rocket science in it, but there's really not, right? Like, what you're trying to do is look at the metrics that everybody understands, and yes, there's a double click on all of these, but this is what you're supposed to do, right? Of course. But this is not how I think about maximizing value. I'm not going to talk to you today about how to operate your businesses. There's going to be somebody that's in construction in this room, somebody that's in tech, somebody that's in healthcare. I know nothing about healthcare, right? I know nothing about construction, right? I'm a fintech, I'm a tech guy, right? So I wanted to pick out 5 principles that I live by, that I preach like the gospel at work, and I want to talk through how I think these principles that I learned mostly through some of those horrible times, that I think can add a bunch of value to anybody, right? And I'm going to walk through each of these, but here's what they are. One of them is the principle of just start. One of them is seek to understand before you seek to be understood. 3 is empower and encourage others to have an opinion. 4 is we succeed by helping others succeed. And 5 is not in these shoes, and I'll explain what that means. First, it's just start, and there's really 2 things I think about. I've watched this over and over and again. At Dell, this was common. At Structure, and at Disney, is so many times there are amazing ideas in the room, right? Like, people have tons of ideas, but nothing ever happens to them. Or a better thing is, there's some significant material issue with your business, right? We've had it, right? The elephant in the room that people actually avoid because it's freaking hard. Nobody knows how to think it through. I am a big believer that finance can get stuck in this thing where they're just the guys who tell everybody all the reasons they can't do something or why something is hard. Any idiot can come up with a bunch of ideas, reasons why you shouldn't do something or do an initiative. I have seen that as you have a culture that loves ideas and cherishes getting them off the ground, that good things start happening. Really good things start happening. So it's an interesting balancing act, and I'm going to talk about it as we keep going. But it can be tricky, right? Because I talked about how we had that product that failed at Structure that we spent hundreds of millions of dollars on, right? And we did a good job of just starting and getting it off the ground. And I'm a believer that it was a good enough idea that it deserved to get off the ground, and it was wasn't a mistake to try it. I mean, other companies have tried to launch very similar products, and they're now multi-billion-dollar businesses, so we had a chance at it, right? Here's what we did wrong, though, is we started, but then we didn't stop, right? I remember there was a quote from, I wasn't part of this quote, but I just want to say there was a quote that went around that we burned the boats, right? We made the decision and we burned the boats. That might be the stupidest phrase I've ever heard in business. Like, you can't burn the boats. If something ends up being a dumpster fire, stop doing it. But I do think you have to start a lot of these things. Another example, though, is we've had activity, they're the elephant in the room things, right? They're so big and they're sitting over your company and they're such a strategic problem that needs to be solved that you kind of just, it's so obvious and everybody knows about it, they just kind of kick it down the road, right? Like they hover over the issue because, and I am a big believer of starting it up down. And I have some tricks that I teach my finance team. I call them, hey, super complicated, let's do a fact sheet. It's like a very common thing that I say. My point is like, if you don't know where to start by literally writing down every fact you can think of around the topic, right? And you'll find that by writing it down and sharing it, it enables people to have more ideas. Right. So, don't just be a culture of ideas, be a culture of action. And I have some other things as we go through that kind of exemplify that more. The next big principle I believe in is seek to understand before you seek to be understood. I think I put in here like a little example. So I wanted to put this little example. Some of you might have saw this on Twitter and LinkedIn. It kind of went around. But it's to exemplify this principle. I love this story. My boyfriend hit me today. That's all you hear. What are we all like freaking out? Want to call the police? Like that's unacceptable. Your boyfriend cannot hit you. You not just hit you. You busted my lip and nearly chipped my tooth. Sounds horrible. I mean, we're all running to our phones. We're trying to figure out how to get this person to say to me. But if you keep listening, it's like, you see, he's my boxing trainer and accidentally punched me when we were sparring. I should have kept my guard up. Right? Totally different concept, totally different situation, right? This is played out to each of you. I know I've been the idiot sometimes that jumps to a conclusion, and finance does it. You tend to think because you have this overarching, widespread breadth of knowledge, that sometimes you hear a snippet and you jump to the conclusion really quick. It's what a lot of finance people take pride in. That's your superpower, right? You can read into these things super quick. It's also what makes you an idiot, right? Like, I know it's made me one. But I've learned again and again that if you sit there and you ask questions and you seek to understand, that over time, it'll evolve your decision making. It'll make you a better leader, right? So I think I have some other topics. So another place where I hear this a lot from CFOs, and maybe this is a tech thing, is markets change, right? What markets value change? An example of this is we were in the middle, I can't remember when this was now, I think it might have been 2019, end of 2019, and we were out fundraising on our growth story. Growth story, growth story, growth story, and people were sucking it up, right? We were pumped for a really big round. It was actually the one that ended up dying of COVID, right? But we had some big rounds that we were working on fundraising. But right in the middle of sometime, I want to say September, October, November, sometime around that period of time. Remember the WeWork debacle, right? Like WeWork was worth like $30 billion, and then it was worth like $7.50 overnight, and the whole SoftBank disastrous like downfall, that's whatever it's talking about. It was hilarious to watch how the market reacted to that. Where overnight, my questions that I received as the CFO completely changed. Where the growth story, yeah, growth story, we got it, yeah, you can grow. Can you do this and this and this and this? And they completely switched. And what I learned through that, though, is you might not change internally what you're doing, and you maybe shouldn't change what you're doing. But as the CFO talking to investors, you need to hear what they value, right? And you need to be speaking the language that's on their minds. If you just dismiss it and think that you're smarter than what the market wants, it's a great way to leave a bunch of money on the table. Because you're not. You can agree, we can all agree that the market is emotional and sometimes stupid. Agreed. Doesn't mean you don't have to listen to them. They're the ones that are going to provide you liquidity. They're the ones that are going to provide you the assets you need to grow your business. So one of the things, I think that what's hard is I think it sometimes is my job to protect the day-to-day operators from this stuff, like keep them, if our strategic plans are still on track. But it's my job to change how I talk about the business to the market. And I watched how it happened. We had to change how we talked about the market. We had to change from spending all of our time talking about this astronomical, multi-100% growth rate to talking about profitable unit economics and lower CAC and all these things. But then it's funny because it'll then switch back too, right? And being very aware and tracking what's going on in the market is important. I had a good, it was actually Josh Coates. He was the CEO of the Structure Multiple Exit CEO. And I love the quote he used to say. He used to say, like, if you think that you're unique, that you're smarter than the way things are done, and that you're above that, you're brilliant, he's like, you're an idiot. right? Like the market has developed certain ways of how things are done, and if you follow those ways, it works, right? And I do think the chances that you're the one that's going to materially change how the market perceives things is very, very low. So focusing internally on the operations of the business and not focusing on changing how the market perceives things is super important. But it comes back to that same principle of seek to understand before you seek to be understood. All right, so this actually might be, when it comes to internal development and growth as a company, I'm not sure there's one I have more passion about, and I actually change it, where it's like empower and demand others to have an opinion. Just like Gary brought it up, or no, it was David. He was talking about that quote from the CFO and the CEO, and how we have to have this. It's my job as the CFO to speak truth to you, and it's the CEO's job to listen. The CEO can be optimistic, but the CFO kind of has to have a realistic perspective. The same rule applies to the people that report to or work with the CFO. Many, many times I've watched as smart people are differential to me as the CFO when I don't know what I'm talking about. Or I'll say something in a meeting with 10 people, and to me, I'm just spitting an idea, and to them it has, I call it, like a boat leaves a wake, where I leave a wake of work behind me, and I didn't even mean to, right? I was spitballing, I was brainstorming, but there's a wake of work that's created after me. And I tie that in, though, to demanding other people have an opinion. And I have some tricks that I've started using, but I have found that the more that you can encourage people to speak up and talk and to express their opinions and their views, and you are trying to understand their perspectives, your team, not only does your culture skyrocket, like people love working for you, they love it, but it also makes you way smarter. So here's a couple little principles that I think is don't hire yes men. But it's not even, you can make a no man shut up real quick if he gets slapped every time he talks to you. He's a no man behind your back now. So it goes beyond just don't hire yes men. Teach people that debating is okay. One of my favorite things that I've learned is I'm a debater, right? And I will pick an opinion even when I'm only 60% sure on it, because 60 is better than 30, and nobody else is. I'll talk about it. But when someone starts arguing with me, I look right in the eyes and I go with them back and forth, back and forth. And then afterwards, I've learned that you stop and you thank them. You say, that was awesome. Never stop doing that. I have never been more proud of you than I was in that last interaction where you fought for your opinion. Now, I'll take the burden that I have to make the decision. That's my burden. You are not required to agree with me. I encourage you not to. You don't have to agree with me after I make the decision. It's not required. It's required that you are always forming an opinion and a perspective, and if you can learn and grow and listen, I will learn and grow and listen. And what I've learned is I've watched analysts become leaders, because all of a sudden they feel empowered to go and argue with the CFO. And it's not like yelling and swearing at each other, but there's some passion behind these opinions. But I actually would go even so far as like telling people, I talk about it constantly on my teams, about, it's that phrase, I guess I'm repeating a little bit, but it's that phrase of, you aren't just allowed to disagree with me, I encourage it. Like, I encourage you, disagree with me, it's totally fine. And the same thing goes for sales functions and product teams. It's like, you don't have to always listen. At the end of the day, I carry the burden of the decision. That's my job. Me and the CEO's job a lot of times. But you don't always have to agree with it. But what it does is it engenders some trust with each other, where they can bring it up. When I make a mistake later, they do it in private though, which is funny. It's natural. Like, hey, you remember how we argued about that? I told you this was going to happen. Like, you did? Facts, right? Let's fix it. But they trust you because you encouraged them at the time. So, big believer in this. It's actually, if I was to say, the number one thing that has made my team better and grow, it's actually enforcing this rule right there. The next one, and we talk about this constantly on my team, we succeed by helping others succeed within the business. I actually, I think being a CFO is a sacred responsibility. Now, I kind of debated, is that the right word? I think it might be, right? It's special, it's unique. Let me explain what I mean. Is you're the only person that usually understands all the stakes at play. You have to deal with the board. You have to deal with investors. You have to deal with the sales leader. You have to deal with the product leader. And all these different people that you're dealing with have different perspectives, and it's your job as a CFO to help everyone succeed. Your job is to make sure that investor gets the return that he's promising to his LPs, right? That's my job. I want him to be successful. I want them to be happy about their investment with us, right? I can't promise that I'm going to be your 100x return, but I'm going to get you a freaking return. That's my job. I'm not going to ask you to invest in this thing if it's not going to get you a return. Secondly, it's the board. Board, I need to make sure that you have reasonable expectations or aware of things that could punch us in the face, right? And I manage those expectations. I like to use, I put it here in the next one, protect. Part of your job is to protect, and that's another code for expectations, right? But I think this is dismissed too often, where CFOs, because they're dealing with the investors, and they're dealing with the board, and they're dealing with the CEO, they feel like that they have some superpower. No. Your job is also to protect everything down to the day-to-day employee. Where this is where, when I talk about I had to do those layouts, I was crushed. I remember going, I like to go for runs. I remember going for runs for like weeks and just crying, running. And I was devastated that I had a sacred trust given to me for these employees, but I was going to help them have their jobs and take care of their families. And we failed. We didn't get the fundraising in time, and we had to let people go in the middle of COVID. And yes, could I have predicted COVID? We went from the best month ever to go down. Probably couldn't have predicted that, but it still felt like it was my responsibility to take care of those people. I want to get a little more specific with go-to-market, right? I think it's an easy habit to be a finance leader that mandates down numbers to go-to-market, as opposed to protecting expectations of those teams. I've learned that wins beget wins. So if you have a culture where losses beget losses, or let's say you signed up for a big number with the board, and then now it's too big, you know it's too big, but you're going to just keep mandating that down to the sales teams, and they're failing, and they're failing, and they're failing. You're killing your company slowly, right? It's your job to go and have the hard conversation with the board, and have a realistic conversation with the go-to-market teams. And I've done both. I've been the mandator that gave an unrealistic expectation that caused us to put hundreds of $millions into a product that failed. I've also been the guy that's gone to the board and said, like, we wrote down too big of a number. Here's why we did it. Here's what we learned. Here's what changed. It's mine, right? It's not my job to just mandate down to go-to-market. And here's what I've learned, though. Teams will fight for you. I've had, when you have a sales leader come to you and say, like, hey, my team trusts the finance team. Like, we can't get, when you gave us a number, like, that number's higher than we thought, but hey, we trust that you guys know what you're talking about. Like, that takes years or months or long periods of time to develop. But I think if you were talking about what maximizes value for a potential exit, it's this trust and credibility that you build over time with these teams so that they know that you got their backs, right? Doesn't mean mistakes don't happen, doesn't mean they're not going to miss a number, but it means that there's a trust and you're listening and you're seeking to understand, etc. Big believer in it. All right, so that's the last one of the mantras, and then hopefully we have some time for questions if there are any, is not in these shoes, right? Those are Kobe's, you can't tell. But I want to tell you where this came from. I actually, one of the guys that I hired when I was first in the structure, his name's Timo. He's a fantastic player, really fantastic basketball player. And we used to talk about mantras, and he said, I think there's something missing. He's like, I think we need to add not in these shoes. I'm like, what the freak are you talking about? I had no idea what he was talking about. And he told me a story. He's like, I was playing basketball last week, and we were down 8-0. And I looked down at my shoes, and I saw I was wearing my Kobe's. And I said, not in these shoes. And he talks about how he got back up and he came back and won. And I love that principle, because the principle that when stuff gets rough, you don't fold, you don't become whiny and bitter and complain, but you say not in these shoes. And I'll show you kind of that little example here. So here's actually, these are our actual performance that we had prior to COVID, right? Without getting into the specific numbers, but you can just see this crazy awesome growth trajectory, right? Over here it's well over 100% growth, right? You can see February where I was so pumped, like growth rate was accelerating, like I was excited. We were also crushing all different leading indicator type metrics. And then COVID hit. It was terrifying, right? But I remember as an executive team, the emotion that's there, but that it's kind of our job to just say, well, it's not good or bad, it is. It just is, right? We've got to deal with the situation at hand. But I used to say the phrase, not in these shoes, and we stepped up to the plate, and we ended up recovering and had really great outcome. This is kind of our progression up until today. So what's interesting, though, and why I like this not in these shoes, is in any business, there's those really sucky periods of time. And it can be not your org. It can be a product org that's failing on a product. I don't know what the thing is, right? But it's your job to help people know that it's okay to like step to the plate and like work through the problem. And what's the phrase that I'm sure you've all said? It's never as bad as you think, and it's never as good as you think, right? And keeping that realistic hat on. But I do think as a CFO, you can be kind of, in those times of crisis, you're the one that can be the one that protects the culture. Because it can be pretty devastating to everybody. But the finance person is aware of everything, controls a lot. You can actually really protect the culture of a company by helping everyone rally around. So I want to give you some examples, though, of what we did. So when we started seeing this decline, and our investment walked away, and we felt like we were effed, right? Like, I'll never forget that Blake, our CEO, who exemplifies this, I actually say his superpower is that when crap is the worst, he's the calmest. When crap's good, he can be all over the place, but when crap is like bad, he's calm. And so in the middle of this scenario, I remember him getting on the phone with like Mitt Romney's camps, government officials, and he was trying to figure out what's the government going to do to help during this period. What ended up happening is we gave away over $2 million. We made something like $2.5 million in giving out those PPP loans. Maybe some of your businesses got PPP loans. We helped something like 5,000 to 10,000 businesses get their PPP loans. I think it might have been more than that. And what's cool, though, is we were really scared of in this period, and what investors were scared of is that we were going to have huge losses. We ended up making more revenue in that period than we received in losses because we made up that. And it was a perfect example in my mind of instead of just folding and acknowledging, we stepped up to the plate, said not in these shoes, and we got through that rough patch. And it all played out well in the end. So that's all I've prepared today. Those are like 5 principles that I literally talk about with my teams, every team, like every finance all hands. I walk through these 5 principles. I've even given out awards to people that are exemplifying specific principles that I think are making the company more valuable. But the purpose of why I talked about that, and I didn't go through the nuances of negotiating a big $2 billion deal, is that deals are going to be different for all your companies. So these principles I truly, sincerely believe can help any finance leader. And they've helped me a ton. But I know that we're like 15 minutes-ish, I think, before the time, which I thought if you guys had questions, though, more about maybe the specific deal or anything, I'd be happy to talk about.
Hey, thanks very much. This is great. I was an early adopter of Billcom like 15 years ago. Great, somebody innovating in the back office and solving a specific problem. must be some kind of intellectual property, something they see here. So could you talk a little bit about, how much of this deal is kind of the economics you're talking about here versus, then building a portfolio of intellectual property that you see something that maybe another acquirer wouldn't see?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I do think that they are probably dealing with somewhat of what I call the Innovators Dilemma, right? Where they were the first ones, and it's actually, I mean, you guys have probably, some of you have experienced it, where you were the first one to the market, and you were crushing everybody because you were leaps and bounds ahead of everybody, right? What Bill.com has crushed is distribution channels, right? That's like their special. Like if I was to just be an analyst for a second and not be like talking to a customer, but we're just talking about an investor, they've crushed distribution channels, right? Banks, accounting partners, etc. That's where their unique ability is. So here's what we saw as Divvy is we were fast up-and-comers. We were the leaders kind of in the space. There's 2 or 3 of us that are pretty impressive. We saw that some of these other leaders were getting heavily funded, similar to us, and the competition was heating up. Now, Bill.com approached us, and I started to just lay down the facts of the situation of, hey, the market's heating up. We have stupid potential as a company. We can keep growing. We probably are a year or 2 off of becoming a public company. We just have to build some of that infrastructure to be able to get there. Our numbers are getting there, etc. But what I realized is like, wait a second here. If we combine with this company, all of a sudden we leapfrog a lot of the new and up-and-comers. Because you take the Bill.com functionality and some of that maybe older technology, you now marry it with some more modern technology with Divvy, where we can make Bill.com better. We also are going to be the first company that has all of that bill pay side of stuff, while simultaneously all having all of that expense management and card type of spend as well. Be the first ones to bring it together. So we're like, wait a second, we're better together. And then what also, as a company that really led us to saying yes, is like, we started saying, okay, we are growing fast. We have a great go-to-market. We don't sacrifice any of that, but we gain all these new channels together, right? So I looked at it as a win-win. This is how, I can't explain all of Bill.com's justification, but I looked at it as a win-win, where we were now going to make their technology better because Divvy was a better, more modern stack. And then they were going to make us better because of their go-to-market channels. And it became a good kind of marriage, right? And that's where we've seen if you Bill.com stock. And we were a big believer. We actually believed that $2.5 billion was a low sell for us. I was openly talking to the board saying, I think we're worth 3 to 4. But, and I talked about these things together, and I said, I think the market's going to recognize it really quick. I don't know, obviously, markets are finicky, but I think they'll recognize it, and I think we have a chance. And I think so far, we've seen that. But does that make sense? To me, there was these 2 sides of it, where we're better together, and we felt like it was a very good marriage.
Yeah, I mean, I hate the word synergy, but it makes sense.
I love the word synergy because I think it's real sometimes. But I get the point, right? I think that there's a lot of synergies. Or I almost think another way is we had complementary skills. Like they were great at, we weren't great at, what we were great at, they weren't great at, and we kind of worked together. Any other questions?
What would you have done differently after going through that process?
Without getting into specific deal terms of sorts.
Yeah.
So here's one of the things that I felt like I did poorly as a CFO, getting really transparent with you, is we initially signed a deal that was less than the end transaction value, right? And then we crushed it for like 3 months in a row, just annihilated it. And I got stuck in like deal mode. Let's get this deal done. It's still a good deal. It's pretty crazy. I remember the CEO flipped his crap at me. Like, are you not seeing what we're doing? We are selling way too low. And I had to be reminded that I'm the CFO. That was my biggest mistake. And that's when I actually built individual about, I did a presentation for the entire board and for our CEO, and I said, all right, ignoring this transaction, independently, here's my perspective on how we're valued. And that was $3 to $4 billion. That's what I thought. I said, I think we're worth $3 to $4 billion. But here's what I think we should do. It's hard not to get to all the nitty-gritty that played out. Some pretty interesting things played out. We ended up using those exact slides to increase the valuation by hundreds of millions of dollars. And the deal got done, right? Here's where I messed up though. I kind of needed to get yelled at. I really did, like that. I got slapped by Blake, and I appreciate it now. But because he slapped me, I got out of deal mode and I got back into maximizing Divvy's value. And here's the funny thing about the end. Sorry, I'm just now brainstorming a bit. The funny thing I learned about the end of these deals is they're not done, they're done. And we say that all the time as a CFO, like, the money's not real until it's in the bank, and the deal's not done until, like we say that stuff all the time. It goes the opposite way, right? You can kill the deal. Don't forget that. Always show them that you're willing to kill the deal. And value just goes up, as long as you perform. It comes back to some of those principles, though, that like the sake of responsibility to manage expectations. One thing we did really well, I'd say, is we crushed every number we ever shared with Bill.com during the process. It was intentional. We built it that way, so that they were getting hungrier as it went through. And those last few months, we increased hundreds of millions of dollars, right? So, and a lot of it was because of that, managing the expectations mixed with being willing to step out of deal mode.
Question for you, to the extent you can share. It sounds like you said Bill.com came to you, but did you actually run a process after they came to you guys and said, hey, we're going to put the company up for sale so you can maximize the value, and you just sort of single focus with Bill.com, and that's kind of where you ended up?
So we've always been dealing with acquirers since the first day I was there. And most of them, most of it's just a waste of your time, and if you're really honest about it. But here's where we actually ran into them. It was our Series D fundraise. So we were doing a formal fundraising process, and they tried to take out our D, right? They wanted to fund the full D, and then they tried to buy us. We gave them the bird, and then right after the D, our Series D came through, they came back, and that's how we did it. So did we go do an extra formalized process? No, outside of the D. So we were always talking to people. So I would say that I had good relationships with the top, maybe 5 of the top 10 potential acquirers. So it's not like we didn't have any, but there was not a formalized process per se. A lot of that's because they lock you in, right? And that was kind of very strong condition of theirs that we had to shut our faces once we got permission.
Just one follow-up question. I don't know Divvy's business well, apart from expense management. In this whole COVID period, right, there's been a lot less employee travel, a lot less employee spend. How were you able to see that growth from sort of February, March to where you're at today? Because it seems like logically that you should be not performing like you are.
Totally. Only 10% of our revenue is actually, 10 to 15% is travel or TV. Most of our spend is kind of like it's a whole, we capture most of the spend at most companies. And so you think of like ads, we do everything. So like ad spend to, everything, right? Software spend. Like some of the first things we do when we get customers implemented, we have some really cool, you can set up a virtual card and you can go and put all your software licenses on virtual cards. And then when they go and try to up your pricing, it'll decline them and it'll cause a good communication for you. So a lot of people like to use this for their procurement because we can lock price increases. They can't increase price on you because they do it like crazy, as you guys all know. We were used for a lot of security, that type of stuff before. But we haven't even seen that fully come back to this day, as you probably know. I would still say it's like half back. If it was 15% of our spend, it's probably 80% of it. Probably not back close to like that.
We used products a lot. We were an early adopter.
Awesome.
Grown with it. In fact, I have a signature page, or I have something in my email supposed to sign to raise our ability. We really appreciate the product. post, we'll call it a merger or
Acquisition.
the organization post-close, usually you put that 5-year model together and you start to consolidate accounting teams and you start to do some of these different things. What's the thought process about post-acquisition or post-transaction integration?
Yeah,
Or is it going to try to be independent?
it's evolving. I should probably be careful with what I say here, because now I have, Renee and John Reddick, the new CEO and CFO, that really own this. But I can talk about the CFO org specifically. I kind of think I lucked out a ton. So initially what they said is, hey, we're going to keep everything independent except finance teams, they're going to integrate. And for me, there was no ego issue there, because John Reddick is the CFO of Billcom, and he's elite. He's fantastic. If you don't believe me, go look at our multiples. He manages the street extremely well. So, because I think the hardest thing in these acquisitions is managing egos. It's pretty hard. But for me, I didn't care. I was like, sweet. This was a good outcome for me. Plus, I now get to go get mentored by one of the greats in the market, and I'm a great private company CFO, I'm an experienced private company CFO, and now I get to go get better at being a public company CFO. I think, so when I think of the integration and the pain, a lot of it came to stepping aside your ego and just embracing the situation. And I think it's been kind of great, right? Now when it comes to product stuff, that's hard, right? The aspiration is easy to understand. Your question, you're like, yeah, I love the aspiration that you guys are trying to do, but we all know that integrating products is really hard. And that's been a little, it's going well, but it's been, the egos has been interesting to watch how that's gone. And I think that Renee and John Reddick, the CEO and CFO, are elite at identifying and then adjusting accordingly. So I'm very bullish and optimistic about the integration potential of the company. Our goal is, we're preaching it to the street, is everything. We want one-stop shop for all of your end-to-end finance needs. So bill pay, expense management, etc. Any other questions or clarification questions? I think, is it supposed to end at 10:30 or 10:40? It was 9:40 to 10:30, I thought. Is that right?
Yep.
Great. So I think we are out of time. If anybody does have questions, I'd be happy to chat, whatever. Also, you can always hit me up on LinkedIn. Expect a delayed response. Not a fast LinkedIn responder, but I love to chit chat and talk about anything. If you're in a deal, I'd actually love it to help, because we do have some lessons learned that on a one-on-one scenario, I probably can give you some thoughts and perspective.